it is.
No, it's not. Oh, John's playing with it because before I even touched it, he muted it from the other room, and I'm just unmuted.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome to the Dalí Museum. This is a very, very large crowd. We are very pleased to have all of you with us. If you're standing and eventually want some chairs, there's a few seats located next door. You can hear me just fine. Also, we're live streaming all of our Coffee with the Curators from now. So if for any reason you're not able to come but interested, they stream live and then they're already on YouTube by the end of them. So you can definitely have some opportunities to go back and see. If you want to review anything I share with you, you can go to YouTube right afterwards. So a couple quick things. First off, thank you to Cafe Gala for sponsoring our coffees. Hopefully you're taking advantage of the liquid refreshment they provide. Also, welcome anybody from AARP. We're very happy to have you with us, and we want to thank the City of St. Pete for allowing us to do this program, for helping us financially make it happen. And of course, if you do have a cell phone, please mute it. Appreciated by all of your friends and colleagues nearby. And we have an extraordinary number of events coming up in a very short period of time. Again, this is on YouTube, so if you need to go back, you can see this. You can also take a photo of the screen, and I'll end the talk with this again because there are just so many things coming up. Tomorrow night, our director, Hank Hine, is doing a poetry event with his colleague and one of our board members, Jeff Goodby. They have written a book of poetry together, and that's what they're going to be sharing, so that's at 6 o'clock. On Sunday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we have an art talk. We have the curator from the Pompidou, Didier Ottinger, and he's going to be talking with our curator, William Jeffett, about the exhibition upstairs. So if Midnight in Paris is something that has really gripped you and you want to know a little more information, I definitely invite you to join us on Sunday. That's going to be a great talk. And another great talk in a very different way is the following Wednesday evening on the 15th. Hank is going to be joining the Florida Orchestra music director, Michael Francis, to talk about the composers in France at that period of time. People like Edgar Varese and Satie and Lessis. So there should be some really interesting discussion about probably some composers you're not familiar with in relation to all the characters we have upstairs in our exhibit. Thursday the 23rd, we're doing an event very much like our called Classics, but we're going to be showing finally Midnight in Paris. So if you love the Woody Allen movie and you want to see it as part of this experience, we're going to have it outside and inside as soon as it's dark. So that event begins 5 o'clock. I think somewhere around 6 to 6:30 is when the movie will start, and it's 90 minutes. So it's a short period of time, but it should be a lot of fun. We also have our game night coming up on Thursday the 30th. That's sponsored by Keep St. Pete Lit. There's a small charge for it, so those tickets are available online, but it's going to be a lot of fun, a lot of exquisite corpses and automatic writings and just some very creative ways to think about surrealism. And then we have our big cabaret on February 1st, which I do not believe I have the right date here. I think it's a Saturday, February 1st. But it's Les Années Folles, 1920s cabaret. We have Beneva Fruitville, incredible drag queen who is going to be leading us through an amazing cabaret. Tickets are available for that. There will be hors d'oeuvres, there will be refreshments and drink, there will be cabaret, an opportunity to dress up, and tours, short tours of the show upstairs. So definitely it's going to be a great night. Tickets are available online. We would love to have you join us. The next Coffee with a Curator, a month out, is going to be my colleague, Shana Harkness. She's going to be talking about the journals and the way that the story of surrealism really comes to life through the pages of the journals where all of these different artists participated. And last but not least, on Thursday, February 6th, we have a benefit fashion show featuring our teen designers who are up in this room over the holidays. They are going to be doing a runway show at Neiman Marcus with a number of Neiman Marcus models and designs. So that's going to be on February 6th, and that's a fundraiser for the museum. So those tickets are available online. I would like to say I'm done, but now we have a talk to do. So thank you all for coming to learn about Max Ernst. And there are a lot of artists featured in our show, so why did I choose to talk about Max Ernst? Well, the first thing to note is that there are more pieces by him in this show than any other artist, including Dalí. There are 3 oil paintings, one of which is an assemblage, and then there's also 5 of his collage novel pages. So he's represented by more pieces, which does say something about his role in 1929. More broadly, he is one of the kind of core artists of surrealism. He was there long before surrealism began. He started Cologne Dada in 1919, and he was there long after surrealism, all the way through the 60s and 70s. To the end of his life, he continued working and really never deviated from what would be considered surrealism. There's also some extraordinary parallels with Dalí, which I'll keep coming back to over and over again. But some of the most important canvases of surrealism are his, and that's what we're going to be talking about. He also explored painting techniques very, very consciously, and in a way kind of revolutionized the way that painting was done in the 20th century. He also had some of the most extraordinary relationships with some of the most extraordinary women associated with surrealism. Almost like a litany of all the women associated with surrealism. At one point or another, he slept with them. So we will find out about that. And as I said, his life is so tied up with Dalí that there'll be lots of opportunities to keep mentioning that. André Breton, the leader of surrealism, called him my dearest friend and the most magnificently haunted brain of any surrealist. That's high praise. That's a pretty amazing statement to have by the leader of surrealism about Max Ernst. Max Ernst also has this particular quote, which I'll read. This is a little bit long, but it's one of those quotes that shows up anytime you talk about surrealism. In a way, he's echoing what André Breton says, which is that we want to both look outside, but also into the interior mind and bring those two worlds together. Max Ernst, as a visual artist, says, if you close your eyes and you look into your inner world, and I believe the best to do is to have one eye closed and look inside, and this is the inner eye, and with your other eye, have it fixed on reality, what's going on in the world. If you can make this kind of synthesis between these two important worlds, you come to a result which can be considered the synthesis of objective and subjective life. So, in many ways, that is the concept of surrealism, is trying to bring these two worlds together, the unconscious of the inner mind and then the external world, and find a way to understand it differently from a non-rational perspective. He also has this great quote. He says, the teachings of philosophy, a woman's nudity is wiser. So that is very much Max. And so in this talk, I'm going to review his life. I'm going to go chronologically. I'm going to review his art. We'll talk about some of the key canvases and key techniques that he developed and explored. I'll try to make an opportunity to talk about the women in his life who really, kind of make it such an extraordinary life he led. And then whenever there's opportunities to talk about Dalí in relation to him, I've kind of worked those in. So it's a bit of a long talk, but I'm going to try to keep parts of it very quick. Very quick one here, but just so that we have it in our minds, the sexual identity, Dalí versus Max. Max is really the great womanizer. He is an extraordinary lover of many women. Dalí's the great masturbator, an extraordinary lover of himself. So just keeping that in your mind really does help to differentiate the two of them. Both, these are probably the two, in a way, the two closest artists in surrealism. And Max was 13 years older than Dalí, so definitely a different generation, but a lot of Max is found in Dalí. So quickly, his origins, background. He was born in Brühl, very close to Cologne, Germany. He was born in 1891. He was in the First World War, and he started what was called Cologne Dada in 1919, shortly after Zurich Dada had began. In 1921, he meets André Breton, and he has his first exhibition that year of many pieces that people consider to be surrealism. A lot of his collages from this period of time are already surreal 4 years before surrealism officially starts with the manifesto. He creates many new techniques, which we'll touch on. Collage was one of his major early approaches, but also then he created frottage, grattage, decalcomania. We'll see what those mean as we move along, but just an extraordinary thinker about what the process is of making an art piece. And he lived to 1976, so he died one day before his birthday, and so his life was about the same length as Dalí's, but just, as I said, a little bit earlier. Dalí dies in 1989, he dies in 1976, but they both lived to 84 to 85. So very, very close in length of time of life. He has a very, very precise understanding of his own birth. He says the 2nd of April at 9:45 a.m., Max Ernst had his first contact with the sensible world when he came out of the egg which his mother had laid in an eagle's nest and which the bird had brooded for 7 years. We're all very familiar with the secret life of Salvador Dalí and the kind of fabrications that Dalí uses with his own historical documents and life stories. Max is very much the same. He's very inspired by André Breton, and he spends a lot of time taking his own life story and making it fantastic. In 1909, so he was, 20 at the time, he enrolled in the University of Bonn. He attended there for 5 years. Unlike Dalí and unlike many of the surrealists, he did not study fine art. He did not learn that traditional style of painting. Instead, he studied philosophy, art history, literature, psychology, abnormal psych, and psychiatry. So he was really thoroughly read in a variety of different areas of understanding, but he was not trained formally as a painter. He also had an opportunity to visit asylums. He briefly worked and studied abnormal psych in an asylum, and he was fascinated by the artwork of the mentally ill. So this is long before surrealism, and it does tell you a lot about the approach that he has to art. And like Dalí, he has some very serious father issues. As a matter of fact, he sort of becomes the template for Dalí's father issues, how you deal with that in your artwork. He was the third born of 9 children into a very conservative Catholic family. His father was Philippe Ernst. He was a strict disciplinarian. He also taught, he was a professor at a school for the deaf and the dumb, and so he knew sign language very well. So this was part of Max's childhood, is knowing his father as being this type of person, a very strict person, very Catholic, and also using sign language. He also had a huge passion as a self-taught painter. So this idea of the lineage of painting does come from his father, but in very many ways it's a reaction against his father. When he was 5 years old, Max was posed as a baby Jesus, which was certainly something that he remembered very well. And becoming the kind of blasphemer, anti-clerical, anti-Catholic he was later, that had a lot of influence on him. This is a very important painting from an early period, 1923. So we're still 1 year before Surrealism officially begins, but this is one of the core paintings of Surrealism. It's a Pieta. It's also referred to as Revolution by Night. And it basically shows Max as a kind of ossified person dressed in a patient's garb, almost like a madman's garb from a psychiatric ward, being held by a very bourgeois figure modeled on a Curatorial painting of a father figure. And the figure has his eyes closed. So it's like a mocking of the idea of a traditional Pieta, a Catholic Pieta. And there's a lot of other different references that are very strange. Definitely it's a father and son situation, so it's the idea of Oedipus and the son of Oedipus who seems to be being sacrificed by the father potentially. They also seem, Max is identifying with the world of madness, where his father's bourgeois reasoning, traditional values. And there's a figure over here that's curious that people debate quite often who that figure is. Some refer to him as being Sigmund Freud, and some also note that he seems to be bandaged, which doesn't make sense with Freud, and it might be the writer Apollinaire. Either way, there's a lot about Max Ernst's paintings that add up to something that you can't quite put together right. You know, he deliberately puts in too much information or gives you things that just can't be synthesized into an easy story. So he likes puzzles and he's drawn to that. And I think you can very easily see the influence that painting had then on Salvador Dalí when he deals with his father in The Average Bureaucrat. The idea of Dalí's father did not look like this, but Max Ernst's father looked like that because de Chirico's father looked like that in his paintings. So it's like, what is the icon for the father? It's this mustache, kind of middle, petty bourgeois individual. So Dalí's definitely thinking about him when he's doing his own father figure. There's also, it's been pointed out that the figure, if we assume this is Sigmund Freud, seems to be very much the same character that appears in Dalí's painting, Lugubrious, or Illumined Pleasures. So there's a lot of references that Dalí uses to Max. He was very, very familiar with Max Ernst's work, and he quotes it quite often. So you'll see that over and over again. Max served in the First World War, and there were a number of key surrealists that are in our exhibition that were also part of the generation that was traumatized by their experiences in the war. The thing that's unique about Max is he was German, so he was on the German side of the trenches as opposed to the French side. This is him as a soldier, so he was drafted. He served 4 years both as a field soldier and an artillery engineer, and he continued to paint during his service. There was a period of time where he was doing map making that gave him the opportunity to continue painting himself. And he was very interested in German Expressionism. He had met a number of people associated with that movement in Cologne, and so he was an amateur, but he was very interested in the avant-garde. And all of his readings in philosophy and psychiatry gave him a lot to bring to that. So he continued to paint during his service. This is one of the canons that he would have been in charge of. And these are the kinds of cannons that lead to massive amputations. They also are, incredibly loud and traumatizing. And so the thing that's unique about Max is he's not just an infantry soldier. He's part of the machine that leads to the horror that everyone associates with the First World War. And it's something that he lives with and, I think influences a lot of his decisions. So also, during this period of time, he had read Sigmund Freud, but he met one of Freud's acolytes, one of the students who worked with him, had some additional readings and started to practice seances inspired by Sigmund Freud during the First World War. So long before French surrealism discovered Freud, Max was already familiar and exploring the world that Freud was talking about with the unconscious and unusual connections. And this photo on the left shows Max on the far left, and then just a typical photo of somebody truly traumatized by their experiences in the trenches. So he had served for 4 years. He returned to Cologne a shell of himself. And he was offered the Iron Cross, which he refused because he had two very minor setbacks. A rifle recoil and a mule's kick are the two, injuries he sustained. So he thought it was just a joke to even be considered for an Iron Cross. And one of the ironies about all of this, one of the really important stories, is that while he's fighting on the German side, Gala Éluard, who becomes his greatest friend and ally, is fighting on the French side. And at the Battle of Verdun in 1916, they were on the two sides of the trench. So this led to a future, meeting that was extraordinary, where the two of them bonded in a way that very few do. So ultimately, he had this description of himself. He said, on August 14th, Max Ernst died. He was resurrected on the 11th of November, 1918, as a young man aspiring to become a magician and discover the myth of his era. So the war totally turned him inside out. He was a different person as a result of it, and that really does inform almost everything he does afterwards. This is one of the first self-portraits that we have of Max Ernst, where he already at this point has become a Dada artist. He was very inspired by what he saw that was happening in Zurich throughout 1915, 1916, 1917, as Dada started to be a movement put together by people who had dropped out of the war, gathered in Zurich, went to the Cabaret Voltaire. He became familiar with this. he had a number of friends, and eventually he met Hans Arp, who was part of the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich. They bonded together, and they created this thing called Cologne Dada. And there was a third friend of theirs named Theodor Bargeld, and the three of them, along with Max Ernst's wife, who he had married, really create the seeds of what becomes Cologne Dada. It was, again, using art not as a way of celebrating life, but rather to criticize society, to try to dismantle rational thinking, and to attack the things that led to the war. So two of the great influences on Max Ernst, one was Paul Klee, the amazing artist associated with Bauhaus. They met. Max was deeply influenced by him, and a lot of his early collages you can see connected to Paul Klee. And then the other gentleman he discovers is, of course, Giorgio de Chirico, who he finds in a magazine, and just, it changes his life. And you can say that Max is the extension of Giorgio de Chirico. Almost everything in his early period, you can see the de Chirico influence. The idea of juxtapositions, unusual but haunting perspectives, strange shadows, all of these things really go back to de Chirico. So the first major technique that Max Ernst really makes his own is collage. And collage was introduced into art by Picasso and Braque and the Cubists, but Max does something very different with it. He's influenced by the Berlin Dada artists, who were very good and very skillful at doing collages, but he turns it into something less political and more strange and kind of exotic and poetic. And this is a really good example. It's an absurd little machine that he created. It has a great title. It's called Little Machine Constructed by Mini Max Dada Max in Person. And it's done in 1919. It's very small. But it has this kind of playing with letters in the same way that Paul Klee played with letters. And you can find the word Max caught within there. But it's also like one of those de Chirico characters that are just assembled together like a big totem, where you just have this assemblage of different things that seem to be people. You're not quite sure how. They also seem machine-like, but you're not sure exactly what these machines are supposed to do. All of this is that kind of just impulsive rage against the machine. You know, the sense of the mechanics of war. This is about the absurdity of that kind of machinery. This is another really lovely one. This is just called Ambiguous Figures. It's rather small, and you can see these strange little, there's a character over here. There seems to be goggles associated with, I guess, a gas mask. There's another suggestion of a figure up here with glasses. There's some strange mechanical apparati that seems to be doing something. Doesn't seem to be anything about romantic, but there does seem to be a relation between these two mechanized, robotic figures. And what's interesting, he's interested in collage, but he's also interested in a slightly different idea about collage. And what I mean by that, this is the page that he was looking at. It was kind of like scientific apparatus, illustrated. And he paints out certain areas, he connects certain areas, and he transforms it, through a kind of metamorphosis into these very absurd figures on the right-hand side. And just as a quick aside, this is very much like what we see with Salvador Dali when we get to a painting like, Dionysus, where Dali has taken a similar page, like a primer from a children's book, painted out certain things and creates this sort of extraordinary couple. This is very late in Dali's life. This is 1958 when he was 54. For Dali, for Max Ernst, this is very much early. This is 1920, where he's exploring this kind of universe. Also in 1920, this is a great and very powerful little collage of Max's on the left-hand side. It's sort of a family romance in the style of Freud. You have the virgin mother right here with the halo. You have the father battling with the beast of this large snake, which is totally Freudian, but it's from the Laocoon. So it's the father against beast, but it's also phallus. And then there's the father and son, and the son has a little halo back here standing by the chair. So again, another father with the Christ child, and all of these things are happening. And of course, the battle is between the father and the son. And then we come to Dalí 10 years later, 1929, First Days of Spring, and you have a reference to that father in the chair over here. You have the reference to collage, which comes right out of Max. You have the step that Max has in his piece. There's just all of these variations that he seems to be working as if everybody knows Max's work to understand where Dalí is going with his work. So there's a very conscious kind of almost a chess game that Dalí is in the middle of this period of time. By about 1931, 32, they're moving in very different directions, but in this early period, there's a lot of Max and Dalí. So going back to Cologne Dada, in 1920, Max Ernst and his friend Theodor Bargel decide they're going to participate in this exhibition. It's open to everybody, no problem. They submit their work, it's rejected. You know, what a surprise. Which leads to a very, very familiar story, but they decide to stage their own exhibition. You know, their exhibit at Refusé. It's called Dada Early Spring, and what's really brilliant about it is they stage it at a winter beer garden. You know, so it's not a museum, but it's already a place for getting inebriated. At this point, ARP has joined them. The show is temporarily closed by the police, and it's not surprising because this is one of the works that was included. But what's extraordinary, in order to get to the show, you had to go through the men's urinal, you know? So you had to go through the men's room. While you were going through that room, there's a young girl dressed in a a communion dress, reciting obscene poetry. And then when you get into the yard and you're confronted by all these just, very shocking pieces, there's even one piece that has an axe and it says, "Please destroy." And so people would dutifully destroy the artwork and it'd be replaced. It's this kind of absurd parody of the whole idea about what is an exhibition about. And of course, the police show up and they shut it down, and then they don't find anything really as obscene as it was said to be, and they open it up again. But it's a perfect Dada moment, and it's like that's the great moment of Cologne Dada. And there are many great moments of all these different Dada movements in Berlin and Zurich and New York, but this was their moment. And it left an influence on the people in Paris. They read about it. So 1921, André Breton, part of Paris Dada, has a chance to meet Max. And he's really just intrigued. Max is everything he had hoped he would be, and he essentially offers him an exhibition in Paris. And so this is the catalog for it. So this is 1921. It's a exhibition of Max's collages. It's in Paris. Max is denied a travel permit. Even though he has a visa, the Germans deny it. So he's not able to go to his own exhibition. But the exhibition is a revelation. Everybody in Paris is just astounded by the work. So Max's career is at this point really in full blossom, even though he never has even entered the country. And everybody finds out about him associated with Dada, and he becomes sort of the cause célèbre. This is one of the pieces from that show. It's made very similar to the earlier one. This was actually an illustration of hats in a catalog for different gentlemen's hats. The piece is called "The Hat Makes the Man." And what you can see is that Max has painted out a lot of it. He has connected these hats as if they are characters, so that each one, again, like a totem pole, each one representing its own figure. And then he's glued a number of hats together over here in this kind of absurd totem collage. And it's perplexing. You're not sure what to make of this, but these are stand-ins for people. So there's an idea of, I guess, the commodification of people that, buying a hat makes you part of that fashion statement. And it doesn't quite resolve. It's really peculiar, it's strange, it's mechanical, it's funny, and that's a big part of it. But it tells you a lot about the way he's approaching work. So he's very spontaneous, impulsive, and intuitive. This is another piece that's far more powerful in a way, and does go right back to his experience in World War I. This is just an untitled piece, but you see the mechanics of the plane that's bombing people, that's leading to these soldiers who are wounded and traumatized, has this sort of absurd sort of combination of person and machine. And so that machine aesthetic that comes from Dada, that sort of critique of the way society had developed, is a big part of his early statement. And then there's this piece, which is almost the opposite side of the spectrum. If this seems very heavy and very, kind of terrifying in a way, this is more silly, delightful, strange, and bizarre. And the title alone tells you that. It's the Graminius bicycle, garnished with bells and dappled fire damps, and the ectoderms bending the spine to look for caresses. So we have references to a kind of circus, bicycle riding, we have sounds with the bells. We have some sort of romantic liaison here. They're looking for caresses. And we have reference to microbiology, so ecoderms. The source of this piece, and it's a very large piece, the source of it is interesting. It's a poster of the metamorphosis of brewer's yeast cells. And so he's taken a scientific, chart, right? And what he's done is he's painted out certain areas of it and turned it into a kind of circus-like bizarre setting. So he's turned it upside down, he's blackened a lot of areas, he creates the bottom here where there's even the title, and then he creates sort of this circus atmosphere where each one of these cells becomes its own character performing for us. It's very fun, it's very crazy, and it's very much what, the kind of excitement that he brought to the story. And now just a brief aside for his first wife and also the introduction of Gala. He had met his wife in 1913. She was the first female to graduate with a PhD from the University of Bonn. She graduated in art history. She quickly became a very important curator, which then led to her becoming a director of a museum. And all of this is very early on. She comes from a wealthy Jewish family. He, of course, comes from a not so wealthy Catholic family. Their marriage was scandalous to both families. Neither family supported them or were happy about it. But they did have a son, Jimmy. And so from about 1919 through about 1922 was the period of time of their relationship or their wedding, their marriage. And it seems like the one thing that really needs to be pointed out about Max is we think of surrealists as behaving kind of in an extraordinary way. In their home life, they are the opposite. They are the most domestic, ordinary, kind of sadly pathetic and, just cliched individuals. She was to keep the food going. She was to wash all the dishes, wash all the clothes, make sure that his slippers were there when he got home, make sure the pipe was ready. All of those kind of just really unfortunate associations with middle-class relationships, marriages, was a part of their reality. So despite all of her extraordinary attributes and successes, their home life, she was still a wife, regardless. But they did have a son. Max loved his son, just loved sort of the relationship. She was very much a part of Cologne Dada. She helped him start the movement. And then 1922, Gala Éluard and Paul Éluard come, and they, just following in the footsteps of Breton, they have a chance to meet Max. They totally adore him in every way possible. And eventually they get together and they do a holiday, the two families. So you can see this is Paul, Gala, and their daughter Cecile. And this is Max's wife, Maria Louise. And this is Jimmy Ernst. And during this period of time, when they're on this holiday in the Alps, Max and Gala become lovers. And so sort of the snake in the garden, so to speak, has happened. And what's extraordinary is Paul identifies so much with Max. They see each other as like the twins that they never had, and they bond completely, particularly over the fact that they were in the same war on either side, and they both had the same sort of fallout from the war, which is disgust, horror, and moving towards using the arts in a way of expressing that they become inseparable. And when Paul learns of the affair that started, he basically feels that I love Max more than I love Gala. It's fine with me if he wants to sleep with Gala. He loves Gala, but he loves lots of women. They have a kind of open relationship, but it becomes really open at this point. These are two paintings that are incredibly important in this early part of Max's career. Both of them are purchased by Paul Éluard. So the Elephant Celebes and the Oedipus Rex are purchased. They're the first two large-scale paintings he does, and they both are purchased by Paul Éluard. So before we talk about that relationship a little further, just want to talk about these two paintings because they really are amazing. So this is Celebes, or the Elephant Celebes, sort of a mechanical apparatus. It's like a large elephant, but it's also a machine. There's a strange headless woman down here. There's a couple strange things going on. And the first thing to say is that it's like a rebus or a puzzle. So he's taking the ideas that he was using in collage and he's starting to paint them now on a much larger scale. And one of the advantages is that he can make some of the transitions much more seamless. He can also change the scale of the image that he's thinking about, but it becomes much more in the tradition of decalcomania. And there seems to be a reference, obviously, to gas masks with this kind of strange elephant monstrous face that's attached with the hose to the tank. And the tank itself is actually inspired by a corn bin that he had seen a photo of. It's a Sudanese corn bin, and you can see very clearly how he's taken this photo and he's transformed it into the creature that we have in the painting. So he's very open to very unexpected chance encounters that then he will transform into something quite different. He also told Roland Penrose that this was inspired by a kind of schoolboy scatological poem that he remembered and was entertained by. Just two of the lines are, the elephant from Celebes has sticky yellow bottom grease, kind of disgusting. And then the elephant from India can never find the whole ha-ha. And it's that kind of childhood rhyme that's scatological that he remembered and sort of became the title, Celebes, the elephant Celebes. And the big picture of it is this female figure here, this headless figure, in a way seems to represent traditional arts, traditional nudes, the idea of the tradition of painting. And it seems to be beckoning on this apparatus, this machinery of destruction. And it's been pointed out that this kind of pole-like figure over here is sort of a stand-in for the man in the same way that the hats become stand-ins for men. And there's a red phallus that seems to be quite excited by the idea that this machine is now being inspired by traditional culture to move forward. So it's like, this was one of the big arguments of all the Dadists against traditional art, is that traditional art did not prevent any of the horror, the destruction, the barbarity of the First World War. So it creates it, it's basically stamped null and void, it's invalid. Traditional arts no longer mean anything in this post-war world. And so this is the connection between traditional art and the machinery of war. And moving forward a little bit, 1927, when we look at Salvador Dali's apparatus in hand, you could make some very interesting connections between these headless female figures that seem to float about, the mechanical structure right in the center, which seems to be a stand-in for a person, and also the idea of kind of sex or eroticism brought about by these very strange sort of references. There's fish in the sky, which I don't know if you can see, but they're up here. And then, of course, there's both fish in Dali's paintings and flies in the sky. So even though Dali's making a very different statement with his work, it seems to be referencing some of the ideas of this painting. And then there's another painting that's just extraordinary. This is Oedipus Rex. And of course, Dali is obsessed by Oedipus and the Oedipus complex. A lot of that's kind of pre-planned, or the template for it exists in Max Ernst's work. This was done in 1922, purchased shortly after by Paul Éluard. And you can see there's a hand that seems to be cut. It's reaching through this little hole in the wall. It's reaching to open this walnut, and then it seems to be caught in this apparatus that seems to be going through its skin. There's two bird heads, one of which has horns of some sort of ram, and there's a little balloon floating up in the sky far, far in the distance. And just a couple things to point out. So this one doesn't have an easy resolution to what's happening here. But we know Oedipus, of course, wanted to sleep with the mother. It was a sexual relationship and puts out his eyes. But we know also this name Oedipus means punctured foot, or the shepherds who brought the child Oedipus out into the forest and then punctured the foot, hoping he would die. But of course, he survived. So what we see here is this puncturing, which seems to refer to that idea of Oedipus as punctured. And yet, at the same time, one of the things that influenced this, there was a photo of Houdini with this sort of knife going through his hand that he was able to convince people it was real. And part of that's happening here as well. There's also, in this particular journal, this nature journal from 1891, the year that Paul was born, he finds the hands holding a walnut. And that becomes the source of the image of the walnut that we have in our piece. But it's been pointed out that the fingers now appear more like breasts, and the walnut becomes like the female sexual apparatus that the fingers are trying to open up. And the idea of all of it seems to go back to this idea of being trapped. There's a trapped, captured situation. The fingers can't move back because of the piercings here. The fingers are trying to get to the walnut, which is also trapped. These bird heads are trapped. And the balloon, which represents escape, seems to be far in the distance. So there's something about it that's very anxiety producing and very much claustrophobic. So it gives you a sense the sort of sources that he's looking to, the way he puts things together, and again, there's like a rebus or a puzzle that he's working through. And in 1922, he creates the image of surrealism 2 years before its time. Surrealism has officially not started. These are all the guys who are part of surrealism in 1924. So Max is right here on the lap of Dostoevsky, of course. Why would he not be? We have sort of a lunar occurrence going on, sort of a lunar eclipse up here in the sky is suggested. We have André Breton here with this very dashing red sash. He's clearly the leader even at this point, long before surrealism. There's a lot of other people in here, including over here to the side, Gala Éluard, who at this point has become Max's lover. And all of them are creating these really curious gestures with their hands. And a number of people have tried to read this or interpret it based on sign language, because Max's father was a teacher of sign language. But it doesn't quite seem to work. Whatever the gestures are, they are not traditional sign language gestures. But it's definitely fascinating, and it's one of those sort of setting up the storyboard for what's going to happen 2 years later when surrealism begins. And it's inspired by Raphael, who is the other figure that, let's see, where is Raphael? Right here. So you can see Raphael's, along with Dostoevsky, the other person, the odd man out, and that's because his painting called the Disputa, which is in the Vatican, where they're discussing theological matters, is the idea here where the surrealists are discussing celestial matters of the unconscious. But very, very creative and unexpected. So let's return briefly to Gala and Paul. So they have a kind of an extraordinary and strange situation that develops, which is that Paul and Max start sharing Gala, and it's kind of a gentleman's agreement. It starts very casually and starts to get pretty crazy. It lasts for about 3 years, from 1922 through 1924. And it becomes so intense that Max keeps hearing in Cologne, Germany, all these references to the motherland and the fact that we will always be in step together. And it seemed like even in 1922, there was a sense of militaristic industrialization, that they wanted to be back in the battle again. And he knew at all costs he had to get out of that environment. He also knew he was in love with Gala at this point. So what's he do? He leaves his wife and son. He uses Paul's passport, and he comes to France as basically with this collage thing where he's Max Ernst with Paul's face. And for the next number of years, almost 20 years, he is living in Paris. So he goes immediately, he settles with Paul and Gala in Sicile. This is the house that they moved to. Paul's father passes, they buy this very beautiful house in the suburbs, which is odd, a surrealist, doing all the surreal activity in the suburbs of Paris. But it was an extraordinary place, and it was made all the more extraordinary by just endless murals that Max kept painting, to the great irritation of Gala. She couldn't stand these after a while. She's like, all I want is for him to just stop painting. But he kept painting. And Cecile, who was about 5 years old, talks about how she hated the house, she hated the suburbs, she hated the disconnection from friends, and most importantly, she hated these paintings. She said they terrified her. She was constantly afraid of these images. And for good reason. They are truly very deeply disturbed. But it's like Max, one of the things throughout Max's life, every place he goes, he starts painting on walls, creating reliefs on walls, he has to turn his living space into an artistic environment. And so that's happening here. One of the most important paintings he paints in 1924, which does coincide with the beginning of surrealism, is two children menaced by a nightingale. And it's just one of those paintings that has been so influential, and it's so strange because it's beautifully painted, it's very simple, and yet the meaning of it is elusive. You can't quite figure out what's going on here. But we know there's the idea of children being menaced by seemingly an older gentleman, a man who's fleeing off to the side. There are real elements as well as painted elements. And he said that, Max said that this was inspired by a childhood experience. He said he had a fever vision when he was sick with measles when he was very young. And he said that the fever vision was provoked by an imitation mahogany panel opposite of his bed. So he was looking at the panel, and he said that the grooves of the wood started successfully to take on the aspect of an eye, a nose, a bird's head, a menacing nightingale, even a spinning top. And shortly after that, he wrote a poem that began, "At nightfall, at the outskirts of the village, 2 children are threatened by a nightingale." And so these childhood experiences, which Freud says mine your childhood, these start to inform his current times. He starts to think about this. And there's a suggestion that this gentleman who seems to be fleeing with one of the children is trying to use this real doorknob to open up something. So that's his means of escape. There seems to be someone who's passed out down here. There's a woman, a female, a young girl running with a knife, very much like Lady Macbeth kind of thing. And there is a nightingale, which seems to be like a little fly off to the side with just no connection whatsoever to what's happening here. And so all of this is very provocative. There's definitely a story that's being told. It's menacing. It's got a kind of Agatha Christie vibe to it. And you just can't add it up into a clear story. So it's provocative and it hooks you, but it doesn't give you any clear indication of what's happening. And this little nightingale here seems to very much be like the cardinal that shows up in Dalí's painting, or several paintings, in the next decade. So that idea, this little bird that seems to be disconnected from everything but seems to be part of the focus, is in our own painting of Skull with its lyric appendage. So 1924, Paul has been having a lot of evenings where he will go walking in all parts of Paris, good parts, bad parts, by himself, while Max and Gala are alone in the house. And he gets very depressed, and much more depressed, until finally he says one night he's gonna go out for matches, and he's gone. And it's like the next few days, they get a note, "Gone, traveling, see you later, I'm fine, I'll be in touch, I borrowed some money from my father, something that was gonna be an inheritance, and I'll keep in touch." And essentially he went through Italy and eventually winds up in Southeast Asia. So Paul just takes off. And I think he's partially inspired by Gauguin. It's that idea of the primitive mind, just go out and explore the primitive, be gone, be away from Max and Gala and all the trouble that was causing. He's left, of course, Cecile, who's also there, unfortunately, in that environment. And it's a certain point when he's in Saigon, he writes a note to the two of them and says, sell my paintings, come join me, let's do this together. They travel, it takes another 4 weeks for them to join him. After a few weeks of trying to sell paintings to get enough money to afford the trip, they meet up, and at the end of 1924, early 1925, Paul comes back with Gala, and Max stays, and he explores Southeast Asia a little more thoroughly. He goes to Angkor Wat, he goes to Vietnam, he really connects with the Southeast Asian experience, but he also is somewhat terrified of it, and it becomes like this moment of transformation. So one more connection, of course, obviously, Gala is part of our story constantly because of her connection with Dalí, but she was also shared by Max and Paul and many, many other men along the way. So they did share this very particularly important person in the world of surrealism. They both did extraordinary portraits of her. So here's one by Max on the left-hand side from just about the end of the relationship. And then the one on the right, of course, this extraordinary one by Dalí, much, much later. And I love this portrait. This is 1926, so it's about a year and a half after the relationship is over. And you can tell it's over. She is a terrifying, menacing presence. She is not an easy, light, happy kind of person. And in many ways, this was Max's thought at this point of her forever forward. So Gala was the woman who sort of broke up his marriage, led him from his son, was part of his world in Paris, but then quickly, in order to become himself, he had to be away from Gala. And so that's what happens at this point. 1925, he's part of Paris Surrealism. Here's a photo of the whole gang, including Gala, Paul, Max, André Breton, and doing, out about on the town. And there's a painting from this year that also clearly connects with our own collection. This is a Max Ernst painting called The Beautiful Season on the left-hand side, inspired by one of his earlier collages. It's like an animal that's been turned inside out, so it's like a specter or a phantom of an animal. And then on the right-hand side, our own painting called the Ram or Vache Spectrale, where we have both the reference to Max Ernst's figure, but also sort of a variation and a next step, like what happens when the ghosts come to rest or something. So you also have Max Ernst's bird and another Uber bird over here. But it's very deliberately responding to Max Ernst's painting. So the next technique that he develops that becomes hugely influential, because surrealism was driven by writers, and the writers wanted to get in touch with the unconscious. And one of the major ways they explored was automatic writing. The idea that there's a stream, there's a voice within us that if we can just tap into, we will get more direct access to the irrational side of our mind. They were very skeptical that visual artists could do the same thing, because visual artistry requires a lot of training. You can't just paint an apple and have it be an apple. You have a lot of training and understanding about what that means through history. And so painting is more deliberate, thoughtful, and thus not spontaneous. Max was one of the early artists who found a way to make it spontaneous. And one of those techniques was frottage. He said that in 1925, he had a piece of paper, he was looking at floorboards, he started to do a rubbing, and it was like things were suddenly revealing themselves spontaneously to him. And so he started to do all of these rubbings. And we all know about this. You know, you go to gravestones and you do rubbings. That's essentially what Max is doing. But what frottage is it takes it one step further, where you let particular textures start to suggest something, and then you start to define it and transform it into something personal. And so he created actually 32 images at this point that was called the natural history. And they were all these different rubbings that then took on the form of something like this figure, which is called the fugitive, where it's a kind of irrational, imaginative creature that has a certain expressive quality to it. And here's another one. This is the habit of leaves, where the leaf has suddenly become trapped between these two walls, sort of like those fingers are trapped within the door. And, you know, it's spontaneous, it's unpredictable, but at a certain point, the artist's mind kicks in and you start to create something rational with the kind of irrational suggestions. So very much like Leonardo da Vinci and his suggestion that the artist should be able to look at random patterns and find recognizable images. And as I said, he was raised by a very strict Catholic disciplinarian. So in 1926, one of the best paintings he ever did, the Virgin spanking the Christ child before 3 witnesses. And it's André Breton, Gala Éluard, and of course the painter. So you can see them just sort of quietly outside the window, just aware of the fishmonger's wife who is tarnishing the backside of Christ. And of course his halo has fallen. There was a lot of people who were super disturbed by this image. This image definitely hit its mark. It didn't have to do a whole lot of juxtaposing of anything to offend and provoke and also delight certain groups of people. This was the inspiration for it. This is a painting that he was very familiar with, a painting from Cologne, Maria and the Christ Child. But of course, also his father had painted him as the Christ child, and his father was a very strict person, and all of these things come to rest when you see this painting. So there is a lot of dark humor in Max's work. Yeah, and this is actually his father's painting, copy after Dürer. So in 1927, he meets this extraordinarily young girl woman, femme et enfant, you know, the idea of the woman child, the Lolita type. There's a young girl named Marie Berthe Orange, and she is supposedly by, I'm not sure which connection, but she is somewhat related to, let me see if I get this right, King Louis XVI, I believe, that there is a connection in her world to that lineage, even though she's not part of royalty, but she does have a legacy of royalty, so that's part of it. She's 20 years old when she meets Max, and Max, I think, is 37 at this point. She is beautiful, she's delightful. She's working both at Elsa Schiaparelli's house of fashion, and she also is working at a gallery that the surrealists were frequenting. So we know for sure that André Breton had met her and was delighted by her. Max not only is delighted by her, but wants to conquer her. And so in 1926, they develop an affair. She's still underage, her father's horrified by every aspect of this, and he sets detectives and police onto them to try to capture them. For about 6 months, Max and her go into hiding, and they keep going to different surrealist houses trying to escape. But finally, they were about to go to this one gathering of surrealists at a particular cafe. The police found out about it. They were just about to make the arrest, and André Breton steps up and says, "I am Max Ernst." And so they arrest André Breton, and Marie Berthe and Max get into the taxi, and they quickly go out to the country for a few weeks, and then she turns 21. So she is now officially old enough for a relationship. They go back, they plead with her parents, and eventually her father, who is a kind of unusual and extraordinary figure, agrees to this marriage. So they get married. He is now divorced from his first wife. He's married, and life is great. Life is wonderful. He's very, very happy. And this is the moment when we suddenly come across this character in his work called Loplop. Loplop is the bird superior. It's also his alter ego. And essentially, he has a story that when he was a child, his favorite pet cockatiel passed away, died. It was the one that he constantly spent time with. On the very moment he discovered that his pet had died, his father comes in and says that you have a baby sister. And so he said that at that moment he became very confused about people and birds and death and life and all of those kind of core things. And so this haunted him. And so at this point, by 1927, we start seeing Loplop as a character, as the artist's alter ego, presented in his paintings and objects. And it continues for the rest of his career. There's constantly birds in his work. So it's like this bird is his familiar spirit and follows him wherever he goes. We have up in our exhibition 3 paintings involving Loplop. This one in particular is called out as Loplop, and this is Loplop presenting a young girl who is right here, who's probably Marie Orange, his wife, Marie Berthe Orange. So all of these things are very good in his life, and this is when he introduces a third technique, which is grattage. And grattage is very much like frottage. Frottage, you're just rubbing pencil or chalk over a surface. With grattage, you build up several layers of different colors of paint. You use material with texture, and you scrape off the paint on top of it after it's dry. And so what you're doing is you're revealing different colors underneath the surface that pick up the texture of whatever the thing is, the texture that you put underneath it, whether it's leaves, floorboards, patterning, whatever it is. But he also develops a group of images that seem to reference the growing unrest in Europe. He calls these the Horde, and there's about maybe 8 to 10 of these paintings where they're against a blue background. There are figures that you can see within all of these horrific figures that seem to be monsters from the unconscious, starting to develop and battle. And these also coincide with another group of paintings he starts called the Petrified Forest. And this is another example of grattage. So you can see there's definitely a kind of unified texture he's using for the ground, for the trees. And then there's always a sun that's out of sight, that's somehow hidden, just flickering there. And this goes back probably to his own memories of some of the forests in Germany, which are both inviting because they're outdoors, but also terrifying in the kind of grim fairy tale way that, there's just faces and creatures hidden within them. And then, of course, his trip to Saigon, where he saw the Vietnamese and Cambodian forests, these incredible rainforests that were both beautiful and just overwhelming and claustrophobic. And so he does a whole series of paintings using grattage, but talking about these particular forest figures. And then Surrealism Phase 2 starts, and that's what our show upstairs is all about. 1929 to 30, we have the gathering of a new group of people. Dalí, right next to Max, here in this very important photograph from 1930. Max stars in The Age of Gold, Louis Buñuel's movie that he did with Salvador Dalí. He's the kind of thief pirate who's battling the archbishops who are out on the rocks of Cadaqués. All very strange, but he becomes sort of a sensation as a star, a celebrity star. And this is when he does his collage novels. So the collage novels were pretty extraordinary, and there's 3 of them. One was done in 30, another one done, I think, 31, and then 34. And he would look at illustrations from the 19th century. So already they were very nostalgic. He would look at scientific magazines, women's journals, illustrations for catalogs for different kinds of companies, and he would very discreetly cut a few images out and combine them in a way that seemed relatively seamless, juxtaposing things that did not belong together, and then he would rephotograph them. And he creates these extraordinarily haunting sort of dream images where things seem very provocative. There seems like there's a story, but you can't quite unravel it. And these were put together. It was published called The Woman of 100 Heads. There were 9 chapters to it. Again, the chapters were very random. There was no real progression. The only text was the titles of the pieces. This just says that they were made in this way, but another one of the extraordinary, very Freudian images. And what's really interesting is André Breton just was incredibly beside himself with excitement over this. He said, one awaited a book that avoids all parallels with other books aside from their mutual use of ink and type. One awaited finally for this book because one knew that in our day, Max Ernst is the only one to have severely refused those considerations that for other artists refer to form. The Woman of 100 Heads will be preeminently the picture book of our day. And so it was the idea that this was a new type of novel. It's not a novel where illustrations illustrate the story that's written. The illustrations are the story, and you have to decipher it. You as the reader have to kind of decipher what's going on within this. And it is absolutely, one of the highest points of his career. So just a real brief reference to the title because it's very, very playful. It's very much like a Freudian pun. La femme sans tête. It has 4 different meanings depending on what you think you're hearing. So you can see with the first one, it means the woman of 100 heads, la femme sans tête. It also can mean the woman without a head, la femme sans tête. It could mean the woman's head of blood or the bloody-headed woman, which is la femme sans tête. And it could mean the stubborn woman, la femme sans tête. So it's a pun. It just has these constant different ways to understand it. Depending on who you are, you might be hearing it completely differently. And that's very much the way that Max is working at this point. Second collage novel, just a reference to it. It's called A Little Girl Dreams of Taking the Veil, probably a reference to his wife who was going to become a nun. And fortunately for him at this point, she did not. This is one of the images from that, kind of extraordinary, very anti-clerical in a very big way. And then the third collage novel, which is probably the most successful of them all, is the one called A Week of Kindness. And it's the most ambitious. It has 182 pages grouped in 5 different books. And there were going to be 7, but eventually just the publisher and Max ran out of steam. So there are 5 books that collect them. Here's the 5 as you would see them. And just extraordinary, compelling, bizarre, haunting images often with bird heads. So Loplop plays a big role in all of these books. So now that we're in the middle of the 30s, we're fully in surrealism, there's a little more to go just to kind of understand it, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. But one of the big things is that despite the fact he's with this very young, beautiful, voluptuous, entertaining girl, she's young, and she seems drifty and sometimes very flighty, and of course, he's Max. And so lots of infidelities happen. And 3 of the extraordinary ones, he has a relationship with Marie Oppenheim, the surrealist painter, and the woman who created the fur-lined teacup. It's a very powerful relationship. He's deeply in love with her. She chooses art over Max. So she said she was in love with him, but she wanted to be her own person, and so she left him. He also had a relationship with the extraordinary Leonore Feeney, who said, Max is incredibly voluptuous, but I am my own person. I don't want to be part of that reality. So she was able to maintain her own distance. And then the great singer Lotte Lenya, Kurt Weill and Lotte Lenya, they had a relationship, and it was extraordinary and great and brief. So all of this is happening much to the consternation of his wife who's being left behind. And during this period of time, I guess her mother passes and she's not able to be there to make any difference. And also she has an abortion. And so those 2 things suddenly lead to the disintegration mentally of his wife, who starts to just go through breakdowns. And it's a very tragic story. During this period of time, Max is doing, again, extraordinary work. He does 5 of these paintings called airplane traps, garden airplane traps, using something that we'll talk about in a moment, decalcomania. But you can see it's a plane, but almost like an insect. It's been caught in some sort of trap where vegetation seems to be exploding from it or feeding on it. And you're not even sure, are these really planes like industrial machines, or are they insects that just resemble planes? Do they have a life of their own, and are they dying in the way an insect would be dying? So they're very haunting. By 1933, of course, Germany is gearing up for their military structure. Hitler is starting to really come into power. Max is very concerned, and his work starts to move back into this direction of violence and terror. And this is when he introduces the technique decalcomania. Oscar Dominguez actually created it, but it's a really provocative idea, because all it is, load the painting canvas up with a lot of paint and press it with either a piece of glass or a piece of aluminum. And at a certain point before it's dry, you peel it back, creating a kind of puckering of the paint. And it creates a pattern. And then what Max will do is he'll use that pattern and paint around it and paint details within it, look at it, start to find faces and creatures. And it's a kind of visionary process. So this painting, which we'll come back to in a minute, is a good example of that. This is one called The Joy of Life. It's beautiful, it's exotic, it's filled with plants and foliage. It's inspired by one of his favorite artists, André Breton, with a tiger attacking a buffalo. You can see the kind of exotic overabundance of plants. But deep within these plants, you have these insects and creatures that are extremely threatening and terrifying. It's like monsters lurk within the beauty. And that seems to be a big part of his statement at this point. This is the one we saw a moment ago, the nymph Echo. And this is really about the idea of, Narcissus and Echo. And Narcissus, who falls in love with his own reflection. Echo is probably the woman that's up here, just barely seen. But the figure here is both bird-like and refers to the form of Narcissus, who, of course, transforms into a kind of foliage, the plant of the narcissus flower. It's like here, there's that kind of metamorphosis, much more broadly, played out with all kinds of plants seen to be blossoming here. And here's a really powerful piece from the same moment called The Fireside Angel. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but the one thing to say is that Max was really clear about the meaning of this painting. Most of his paintings are very open interpretation, but he painted this one right after the fall of the Republican government in Spain. And for him, the idea was that this is the first step towards the trampling of everything. There's kind of this gleeful horror of this thing that seems to be crushing everything underneath its feet. He said, as goes Spain, so will go Europe. And within 2 years, that's exactly what happened. So he was very much predicting what was about to happen. And then just very quickly, reference to Dalí, the nymph Echo and metamorphosis of Narcissus, very much in tune with the same myth, doing it slightly differently, but they're very much falling on the same idea. Not necessarily that either influenced the other, but they're very much in sync with each other. The Joy of Life, connecting with the archaeological reminiscence. Dalí's obsession with insects, particularly praying mantises, goes very well with the kind of beasts that were starting to populate Max's paintings. And of course, Dalí's response to the Civil War, or the beginning of the Civil War, matches up very well with Max's response to the Civil War itself in 1937. So really interesting and fascinating paintings, all of which are core paintings of surrealism done by these two artists. So now briefly, Leonore Carrington, exquisite woman. His wife is psychologically slipping into madness at this point. He can't deal with her. She's become emaciated. She's disconnected herself from his life. And he goes to London for a lecture and meets this dazzling young 21-year-old, this young art student, introduced to him at a dinner, and it's immediate love. And for the next 3 years, they're inseparable. So she returns to France with him. He's 46 and she's 20, and he was still married at this point. But they form a relationship that is ongoing. This is one of the paintings that's painted during this period of time. And then, of course, the 1939 Robbing of the Bride, where there's lots of Freudian references to birds. There's strange hermaphroditic references to alchemy down here at the bottom. There's these incredible figures with all of this kind of textural painting that comes from both decalcomania, but also his precision as an artist. He has really grown to be one of the finest artists of the 20th century at this point. And the really provocative sort of reflection of this combination of figures in the background. All of this is inspired by his connection with Leonard Carrington. They're having this relationship where they have, very briefly, he's had a falling out with Breton, and so he goes to the south of France, and that's where they're living, and he turns his house into an environment, a surreal environment. And in 1938, during this period of time, he and Dalí are both drafted to be advisors to the International Surrealist Exhibition. They are listed that way in the book. Right here, Counselors Spécial, Salvador Dalí and Max Ernst. This is when Dalí becomes a persona non grata to the Surrealist group, and it's where Max is also going to have some problems. They both create some of the mannequins for that show. And then World War II happens, and this is where Max's life really gets complicated. First off, right before World War II, there's the Degenerate Art Exhibition in Germany. And his work, which you can see all the way over here, the portrait of Gala from, I believe, 1923, is put into that exhibition. And basically it was stated that this painting was a slur on womanhood, on German womanhood. So it was singled out as one of the examples of what's wrong with modern art, according to the Aryan nation. And as a result, the piece disappears. It's never been seen again. But he clearly knows where he sits in this new world. This is a photograph of him. And at the outbreak of the war, he was imprisoned by French authorities on the thought that he was an undesirable foreigner. And so he spent a lot of time in a very unpleasant brick, it was a makeshift prison in a brick production form building. He also shared a cell with Hans Bellmer, another surrealist who was German. And he was separated from Lenore, who was by herself, a strange English woman, very young, in the middle of this French countryside with a lot of very unfriendly neighbors. And so she was having a lot of difficulty. Fortunately, Gala Éluard comes to the rescue. He writes to the prime minister, basically says, this is my absolute best friend. He's an important figure. He came here because of his love of his country. And for a brief period of time, Max is released. And during that period of time, he and Lenore reconnect. He paints this work called A Moment of Calm, which is very prophetic, because very shortly after that, Germany marches on Paris. And that's when the Gestapo arrests him, and he spends more time in prison. He escapes and is arrested and spends more time in prison. And he's definitely an undesirable. He will be executed if he stays there. Leonora has a very terrible personal breakdown. This crisis is unsurmountable. She breaks down. Her friends take her and bring her to Spain, and her father meets her and realizes her state of condition. He institutionalizes her, and she goes through probably shock therapy. She writes about this. Surprisingly and amazingly, she escapes, and she meets with the ambassador to Mexico, and they have a makeshift marriage so that she can have papers to get to the United States. And just the quick foreshadowing is that when they're in the United States, when Max is with his next person, Peggy Guggenheim, the two couples meet in New York City, and it's a complete tragedy, really, because they have both moved on in such horribly different ways. They've experienced such terrible things, and whatever their bond was, too much has happened too quickly for it to ever reignite. So bringing us to Peggy Guggenheim, incredible heiress, put together one of the most important collections of art in the world of the 20th century. She goes to Marseille, where Max has wound up, along with many of the other surrealists. She purchases a lot of his paintings, and she starts finding out about his situation. And she falls in love with him. And so over some very arduous periods of months, they find a way to get papers for Max. They arrive at Ellis Island. Max is about to connect with his son, Jimmy, who's been in the States for a couple years. And then he's seen as an alien undesirable, and he's sent back to Ellis Island. And it takes another series of, extraordinary things to rearrange this so that finally he's seen as okay. So here they are, 1941. You can see Max is not quite the collected, calm self that he had been before. Peggy saw him through, got him finally to be officially allowed to be here in the United States. And then Lenora Carrington shows up and she has a lot of Max's paintings. And Peggy's like, hell no. And she takes Max and they go to California. And so in California is where Max finishes this particular painting called Napoleon in the Desert, which shows him kind of as Napoleon, the leader, but the one who's kind of been through so much that he ends in failure on some level. And the other thing that's been pointed out is almost every woman he paints in his paintings has Lenora Carrington's face, not Peggy's. So Peggy, although married to him at this point, is sort of heartbroken because she realizes he still loves Lenora. So anyway, fast forward, this is one of the most important paintings of his entire career. Starts in 1940 and is finished in 1942, called Europe After the Rain, where you have the use of decalcomania to create a post-devastation world, where Max as the Birdman, Loplop is here, Lenora Carrington is the dressed figure who's moving away, and it's basically the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, where she has to return back to hell and they're disconnected and they can never be brought together again. It's extremely powerful and really the greatest work probably that he did in his career. And then just real quickly, just to wrap up, there's just a few more things. He does this painting, which is called Angelic Flute, to celebrate his 54th birthday. 54 little boxes here, almost like a summation of his entire career. He paints the Eye of Silence, which is absolutely mesmerizing and captivating, but very similar to Europe After the Rain. He creates something he calls oscillation painting, where he takes a bucket of paint, puts a hole in the bottom, and will swing it in a kind of oscillation form. So he gets very interested in process painting, shows it to Jackson Pollock, who takes it in a different direction. So, you know, some really intriguing career-changing moments. And one more really big detail with Dalí. There's a movie coming out called The Affairs of Bel-Ami, and there's a competition. All these artists, 11 artists, are invited to paint the work that will be included in the movie. Dalí participates, Max participates, Leonor Fini participates. The judges are, let's see, that's coming up. This is the work by Max on the left-hand side, totally coming out of a kind of Grunwald sort of German Gothic universe. Dalí's is much more post-Catholic, you know, nuclear mystical period with space elephants and whatnot. But the judging group, Alfred Barr, Marcel Duchamp, and Sidney Janis, they go with Max. They find Max's work to just be absolutely overwhelming, and it's the work that winds up in the movie. And it is just one of the most incredible paintings of both suffering and then possibilities in the background. Dorothea Tanning is his final woman he meets. Seemingly, he marries her, and this seems to be it. I don't know if he ever cheated on her, but I don't know they had the opportunity. It seems like once they marry, they move out to Sedona in Arizona, where suddenly the world that he had been painted for 10 years is a reality. You know, he was just blown away when he went to Arizona. And so once they meet, that's where they move. They met when he was going over to see what her artwork looked like, to see if she should be in this particular exhibition. He was asked to check on her work. He saw this, she didn't have it titled. He said, oh, it must be Birthday. That became the title of it, and that became the beginning of their relationship, which lasted for the rest of his life. So here they are in Sedona, where they created an incredible artist compound for themselves. He did some pieces that he called the microbes, which are about this big, about an inch tall, so going to the exact opposite side of scale in the way that Dalí also works with scale. He explored scale, so he created these super tiny pieces. You can see they all fit into a matchbox here. And then just the really important thing to know is that just like Dalí, he had his trials and tribulation with André Breton. In 1926, he and Miro designed a set for Romeo and Juliet, and they were immediately reprimanded by Breton, saying that they were getting money for their art and they're prostituting themselves. So he almost got driven out of the movement then. In 1938, there was a fight between Éluard and Breton. He sided with his friend Paul Éluard. He was dismissed from surrealism. He kept being shown with the surrealists, and then finally in 1954, Max was chosen as the artist to win the Artist Biennale in Italy. And as a result, or the Venice Biennale, and as a result, unequivocally, he is no longer a surrealist, according to Breton and the new group of people who were associated with surrealism. So he went through many trials with Breton, just as Dalí did, but Dalí's final expulsion was a little bit earlier, in 1939, where Breton said he is of zero interest to the surrealists at this point. Last photograph, I don't know when this was taken, but I know it had something to do with Dalí's exploration of exploding paint. And it doesn't seem like Max is too enthused about it, but he's there along with them for the photo. And then a more civil photo that I can only imagine what the conversation was like, but Gala and Dalí with Max at a very, very proper art opening, having a very, I'm sure, unpleasant conversation. And then the final years, just to wrap it up, in 1975, he did really well in the 60s and 70s. Suddenly, by the end of the 50s, people wanted to show him. He started to make money. People were buying his art. Peggy Guggenheim was really, in many ways, responsible for that discovery of him. And so he lived really celebrated in the last 15 years of his life. He has a beautiful sort of overview of who he is. He says that he talks about his work as being seditious, uneven, contradictory. It's unacceptable for specialists of art, of culture, of behavior, of logic, of morals. On the other hand, it has the gift of delighting my accomplices, the poets, the pataphysicians, and a few illiterates. So that's his kind of summation, his epitaph of his own career. He dies on April 1st of 1976, one day before his birthday, at the age of 84, and you can find his tombstone at Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. And there's a really nice statement by his son, Jimmy. Jimmy says that there was about this man, my father Max Ernst, an almost unreasonably magical combination of physical beauty and intellectual sparkle, a magnet for which there seemed to be no defense. And if you want to explore more about Max Ernst, if you go to Bruhl, right outside of Cologne, there's a Max Ernst museum, and every collection, major collection in the world seems to have great Max Ernst paintings, so there's plenty of places to see it. And these are two sources that I use that if you wanted to go further, the one on the left-hand side is a good movie that I know many people were here for the showing of it last week. It's a great movie about his career. And then the book on the right, if you want the salacious details about the trials and tribulations of his love life, everyone is discussed in there, and it's quite entertaining. So with that, thank you all for coming out today. Hope you enjoyed it. And the last thing I'd say is that I'm really hoping at some point in the future we do a Max Ernst show, but who knows if that's going to happen. So if you have questions, I can talk to you up here. Thank you all for coming out.